Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Tinatin Japaridze, an analyst with Eurasia Group. Tinatin, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me back, Brittany.
I want to talk about where we are exactly when it comes to the war between Russia and Ukraine, because this week we passed President Trump's 100-day marker in his second term. And he promised on the campaign trail he would end this war in a day. That hasn't happened yet, but Secretary of State Marco Rubio called this a very critical week in the talks between the two countries. And he said this over the weekend on Meet the Press, quote, "Throughout this process, it's about determining, do both sides really want peace, and how close are they or how far apart they are after 90 days of effort here, over 90 days of effort." He also added this, quote, "There are reasons to be optimistic, and there are also reasons to be concerned. It's complicated. If this was an easy war to end, it would have been ended by someone else a long time ago." So talk to us first, if you could, characterize exactly where we are in this, what he called very critical week in negotiations between Russia and Ukraine.
Absolutely, Brittany. And I do actually agree with the Secretary that it's a complicated situation. There has been progress, especially over the last few days. We have seen that there's movement again, and it sort of tends to ebb and flow a little bit. There's stops and starts, and sometimes they're false and other times they're not. But essentially, at the moment, I think in terms of the U.S. role in particular in the ceasefire negotiations and where the two sides are in peace talks, and the two sides being Russia and Ukraine, but also Ukraine and the United States. The U.S. has played an active but challenging role in ceasefire negotiations over the last few weeks in particular. So we've seen some positive signals from a recent meeting between the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Vladimir Putin. But even so, there have been no major concessions as such from Russia as a result that might actually shift anything in a tangible way. So European governments, on the other hand, continue to support Ukraine. And with this sort of backing, Kyiv insists on an unconditional truce and has already rejected key aspects of the latest U.S. ceasefire proposal. So Washington is doing its part in many ways to apply pressure on Moscow to a degree. It has also been applying pressure on Kyiv too, but in terms of Russia, there's threat of sanctions, and even so, a durable ceasefire is highly improbable in the near term.
I want to talk about a meeting we saw really stunning images come out of the Vatican over the weekend, because the last time that President Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, met, it was fireworks in the White House, a late February meeting there. This weekend, they were at the Pope's funeral, and they were sitting almost knee to knee across from each other by themselves at the Vatican. I mean, talk to us about, that stunning image, what that meeting meant, and the impact that that meeting has on ceasefire negotiations.
It really was a stunning image. I completely agree with you, Brittany. And I had to zoom in because at first, when the images surfaced online, I wasn't even sure. I mean, nowadays, you don't even know what's AI generated and what's real, right? It just looked so stunning to me. But the meeting indeed was very significant in terms of signaling at least some limited diplomatic flexibility. So Zelensky's overtures to Trump positioned Ukraine as open to concessions and progress in a way, which was essentially helpful for Ukraine's diplomatic posture. But that said, this did not necessarily grant Kyiv greater leverage with Washington, as President Trump appears to be focused on achieving a broader deal with Russia aimed toward a U.S.-Russia normalization, and he believes that he can hold more leverage over Ukraine in negotiations. You and I have talked in the past about how there's essentially two sets of talks that we are watching in real time. There's U.S.-Russia normalization talks, and then U.S. negotiations on the ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. So at times the two do diverge, but there are times when there is no overlap at all. So that is very interesting to me that in particular, this meeting was very important for U.S.-Ukraine relations, I think. But in terms of any major concessions that we may have seen vis-a-vis a possible ceasefire, it takes, in most cases, two to tango. But in this case, it's going to take three to tango, because just like we cannot forget Ukraine when we talk about a ceasefire or ceasefire negotiations, in this case, we also cannot forget that the important element here is Russia. And I would argue, Brittany, that actually Russia is going to probably be the most important element here in terms of a durable ceasefire, because until Vladimir Putin is ready to really come to the negotiating table and really roll up the sleeves and talk about something that can be done in a tangible, durable manner, there really can be no truce as a long-term solution, let alone a peace settlement.
Let's talk about the Russia element here, because it seems like Zelensky has been trying to shout from the rooftops, hey, Vladimir Putin does not negotiate in good faith. And it seems like President Trump could be picking up on that. This is what he said in a Truth Social post. Quote, there was no reason for Putin to be shooting missiles into civilian areas in cities and towns over the last few days. It makes me think that maybe he doesn't want to stop the war. He's just tapping me along. So it seems like President Trump is publicly musing, hey, is Putin taking me for a ride here? What do you think of that?
Well, actually, the meeting that took place between Zelensky and Trump, it also led Trump to publicly threaten additional sanctions on Russia if his counterpart, Vladimir Putin, refused to agree to a ceasefire. So we should note here that Trump has not necessarily been consistent in following through on such threats that he has made in the past, but he appears to be visibly irritated, because ultimately he needs to get some sort of a win. Now, what that win looks like on the battlefield is not necessarily going to dictate to President Trump whether or not he's been able to get what he needs to get out of these negotiations, because he needs to show that he has delivered on his promise, if not to end the war, to at least come up with some sort of a solution that results in a durable ceasefire. So not a ceasefire for 2 days, but something that lasts a little bit longer. Now, I'm very skeptical that this can be a long-term ceasefire, because again, we are dealing with Vladimir Putin, who I don't think is going to give up on taking over Ukraine anytime soon. And I think President Trump knows this to a degree, but he may be underestimating how important essentially having full control down the line of Ukraine is important to Vladimir Putin. This is not something that Putin started thinking about last week, and it's probably something that President Trump started thinking about and worrying about relative to Vladimir Putin somewhat recently. So it's a little bit difficult for him to calibrate the importance of Ukraine in this conversation with Russia compared to how he views the importance of this ceasefire and an end to the war.
I want to talk about something you said, something Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, and that is both sides need to want peace, need to want a permanent ceasefire for this to work. Is there evidence, you're saying no time soon, that Putin, that Russia wants a permanent ceasefire? Because he did offer that temporary ceasefire from May 8th to May 11th. Zelensky said that's an attempt at manipulation, but it does take Russia to come to the table in a meaningful way, saying, hey, I want a ceasefire too. Does that look like that's happening?
Well, I do think, Brittany, that actually Vladimir Putin had to give something to President Trump, because obviously patience in Washington has its limits, and President Trump, and not just his broader administration, but him specifically, he was starting to really lose his patience, as you alluded to this earlier in your question. And I do feel that it was very important for Vladimir Putin to at least hand something over to his U.S. counterpart. Now, is this a solution? I don't think so. I think it's a bit of a stretch to even call it a Band-Aid, because we have seen, sadly, that Russia does not necessarily abide by its own unilateral temporary halts to fighting in terms of any commitments to that. That it ends up breaking very quickly whenever it decides to do so. So in a way, the Victory Day related temporary halt in fighting that President Putin announced for the May Day and broadly for the May Victory Day observations, I think this signals that Moscow does not anticipate a lasting ceasefire agreement anytime soon. Because if they were to think that a longer term ceasefire is around the corner, I don't think that 2-3 days would really be worth even discussing at this point, because they would be working towards something more durable. So I am skeptical about this announcement. I am generally skeptical about these unilateral sort of moves and commitments to stop fighting for a couple of days, because what does that actually do? Perhaps it signals that there is some willingness to stop, but then there would really have to be a total halt in fighting. And in the prior examples, including over Easter, we have not seen that. So, especially through the prism of a truce, if anything, both Russian and Ukrainian positions on the broader war and any prospect of a peace settlement as such continue to be unchanged. So at the core, we still have the same problem. There's massive distrust between the two sides. And as we've discussed over the past several months when we revisit this topic, anything that is really going to signal a political settlement, a peace settlement, is going to be unlikely, not just in the coming weeks, but I would argue that we really are at least months away from even seeing realistically, can there be any sort of a durable solution here? And I'm just not sure that Vladimir Putin feels any real pressure, especially bearing in mind that Russia does continue to stand pretty strong on the battlefield, for them to feel like they really need to stop fighting because they have to regroup and rearm. There's just no need for them to do that.
If you think that it's going to take months to really see a durable solution, do you think the United States then goes, you know what, we're done here. We're washing our hands of this. You two come to the table. You two negotiate without us. We're leaving here. Is there a real threat of the United States walking away from these negotiations? And what does that mean for the negotiations, if so?
Well, I do think that there's a bigger threat and a bigger risk of this happening. So a few months ago, we would have said, especially under President Biden, we would have said that this was just not on the cards anytime soon. Now, I think because the current administration feels like its patience is being tested, the Trump administration and President Trump specifically, I do feel that he feels a level of irritation and potentially humiliation if Vladimir Putin does not come through. Because in many ways, I think Trump is actually putting his own reputation on the line to a degree, in terms of saying, I am trying to do what I can here to get the two sides to come together and achieve peace. But if one or the other is going to essentially not do their part or do less than what they're supposed to do, then it makes him look bad. So he could very well throw the towel in and say, I don't want to do this anymore. Now, do I think that there will be pushback, including from his own administration, and they're going to probably talk him into changing his mind? Because this is not a great strategic move, I don't think, for the United States. I think that's possible, but I think him showing signs of, at times, losing his patience, being quite impulsive in terms of his decision making, he could very well say, I am not going to do this until you two come back to your senses, whoever that may be that he feels is the one that's not doing their part. And that's a risk. If that were to happen in the worst case scenario, I do think that at that point, Europe would really have to ramp up its involvement, its support. They're already working on that. We see not just the European Union as a bloc, but individual European governments that are very aware of this risk. And they understand that this is a possibility, especially under Donald Trump. So they do have to think about a what if scenario that is no longer just a tail risk. I think for some of those countries, that's actually a base case scenario that they have to operate under. And if that happens, there has to be a switch button where either individual European countries or the European Union as a bloc has to have some sort of a solution for what will they do if that comes to pass.
Another development we saw this week is the United States and Ukraine signed that long anticipated minerals deal. And we saw that really break down in that fiery meeting between Zelensky and Trump at the White House back in February. Both sides touted this as a victory. What does this deal do for the negotiations and the war at large?
Well, it was a big deal. And obviously, 2 months after their infamous Oval Office debacle, the U.S. and Ukraine announced, as we know at this point on Wednesday, that they had finally struck this long-awaited minerals deal. The agreement is most likely going to get ratified by the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, very soon. So there's no reason for us to think that something is going to change on that front, which I do think that this is actually good news. But we should note that in terms of this deal, that's, sort of a more balanced, the terms that are more balanced in the initial U.S. proposals, what we saw initially from the United States was seen by Ukraine as an unfair deal, whereas this draft, the final draft, has been assessed, including by the Ukrainian side, as something that is more fair and more balanced than what had been floated in the past. So essentially, the deal is going to establish a joint investment fund with equal U.S. and Ukrainian ownership and on developing Ukraine's rare earth minerals, which, just for your viewers, these are essential for electric vehicle batteries, various consumer and military technologies, as well as oil and gas projects. So this is a big deal. Now, the deal is limited to the new mineral resources projects, by the way, and this is designed not to interfere with Ukraine's EU relationships or membership negotiations, which is very important for Kyiv. And this is something that they were trying to get. And it's also important to underscore that the U.S. is actually shifting away from tying such economic agreements to repayment for past assistance, which, as you recall, Brittany, you and I talked about this, I believe, not long ago. And this suggests a more sort of an improved framework for future U.S.-Ukraine relations going forward beyond just this deal. So it is a big deal, but by the same token, what the deal does not do is that it does not resolve the fundamental differences between Ukrainian and Russian perspectives on Ukraine's future. And as I said earlier, there will still continue to be a great deal of mistrust between them. And I'm very interested to see what the Kremlin has to say officially about this deal. So far, as of right now, as of Thursday afternoon, I have not seen any statements coming out of Moscow. It is quite late in Moscow at the moment. I think they're still very much digesting all of this. But at the end of the day, this deal and securing U.S. involvement going forward is going to be a positive development for Kyiv and more broadly for Ukraine's defense efforts. I did read actually one of the opposition MPs in Ukraine who said earlier that, we weren't choosing between good and bad. We were choosing between bad and worse. And I do think that compared to what was floated earlier, this is a much better deal for Ukraine. And I do think it's a good deal for the United States because, let's face it, pragmatically speaking, the U.S. gets quite a lot out of it.
I want to talk about what specifically you're looking out for next, because end of next week, we're going to see that temporary ceasefire that Russia has called. Historically, as you said, Putin doesn't really honor ceasefires. So I'm curious, after that, what specifically do you think comes out of this?
Well, it remains to be seen overall how the talks on U.S.-Russia normalization also progress. I'm very interested to watch that unfold in the background because I think that is going to be important because the U.S., I do believe, over the next few weeks will continue to be critical for the Ukraine-Russia ceasefire negotiations to continue and to stay on track. So in that respect, what's also happening behind closed doors between Vladimir Putin's people, so to speak, and President Trump's people is going to be very, very important. And that will in many ways dictate whether or not the Trump administration will be fighting for the interests of the Ukrainians or the Russians. Because I don't believe that it is possible for the United States, with all the goodwill in the world, under any administration, to be able to represent the interests of the two sides equally. That's just not possible. Any deal maker, I think, would tell us that the U.S. would have to lean in one direction a little bit or the other. Being purely objective is going to be very hard because, let's face it, we are still in the middle of a war. Ukraine and Russia are still very much at war. And it's going to be hard for anyone to say that we are being purely objective here. So that's one. So watching the U.S.-Russia normalization process will be interesting over the coming weeks. Secondly, I do agree with you entirely, Brittany, that I am very skeptical that Russia will honor its own unilateral commitment to stop all fighting over the May Victory Day observance and celebrations. That is something that I am not necessarily counting on. And even if they were to stop, there will always be something that triggers Vladimir Putin, where either he feels that he's been provoked by Ukraine or he felt that he had no other choice but to fire back. And I think that's how Russia will formulate this, is we have to strike back because we were provoked. So in that respect, this very brief halt in fighting is not something that I am necessarily going to use as a thermometer for myself in terms of what this means for tangible, durable ceasefire talks going forward. It's going to be interesting, and perhaps the most interesting element here is going to be, again, the United States. At what point will Washington actually feel like it has had it, so to speak, and it no longer is interested in continuing to be actively engaged in the process? I don't think that Washington will ever completely walk away from this. It's just too big a deal. But even so, at what point would President Trump signal to his team that he's done, at least for the time being? Because if that happens, then we are going to have to talk again. And it's always a pleasure for me to talk with you, but we really have to then reassess, what does this mean? Because everything that we've discussed today about whether Europe would get more actively engaged in these processes and what that means for European capitals, that is going to be worth a thought, because then that whole process will get accelerated at a crazy speed, because suddenly the pressure will be on times 100. So let's see what happens. But these are some of the signposts for myself and for us at Eurasia Group that we're watching very closely. And of course, we have to bear in mind that aside from diplomacy and negotiations and a lot of politicking that is going on, there's actual battlefield developments that are very, very important to bear in mind. And we need to see what's happening on that front. There is nothing that is going to be changing the situation overall over the coming days and weeks. It's unlikely that anything will massively change, but there's some progress Russia has made, and it remains to be seen how much more they'll be able to do. That is worth watching, because at the end of the day, this is a hot war. This is not a hybrid war only. This is a hot war. And that's why it's going to be important for us to see, against the backdrop of diplomacy and politics, what is actually happening on the battlefield.
I think those are two very important things to keep in mind. A, what's happening on the battlefield, and B, at what point does President Trump say, I need to walk away from this right now? Not fully, but I need to put this to rest just for now. And I think that that's going to be an important part of the conversation for us to rejoin, to regroup on. And I always appreciate our conversations. I hope to have you on as the situation really continues to develop, and as we see what really is the fallout of this very critical week. Tinatin Japaridze, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me back.